I've
Mm.
seen so much embezzlement happen, so much lying. I had a married couple once who claimed that they had 10 dependents, so they didn't get income tax very much. People hear that big corporations don't pay taxes, right? Don't believe it. I had a couple who owed over $400,000 in income tax.
Welcome to Inspired by Success. I'm your host, Linda Vo. Imagine turning your biggest tax headache into your greatest business advantage. Sounds impossible, right? Well, our guest today is about to change how you think about those tax nightmares keeping you up at night. With over 2 decades of experience, she's turned countless tax nightmares into success stories for both individuals and businesses. She's on a mission to show that dealing with tax debt doesn't have to be scary. With a best-selling book and a talent for making tax talk easy to understand, she's helping entrepreneurs worldwide face their tax fears head-on. Get ready for a masterclass in turning scary tax letters into good news for your bank account. Welcome to the show, Morgan Anderson.
Hi, thank you, Linda. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Let's talk about your entrepreneurial journey and the life lessons. How did you end up in tax debt resolution? Like, it's not your typical career choice, is it?
And when I tell people what I do, they say, wait a minute, you do what? I refer to it as a funky little corner of the tax world, right? You have your typical accountants and CPAs and bookkeepers, and they're dealing with the front end, right? How you keep your books, how you report your quarterly or your annual tax returns to your government. I deal on the back end when you have reported your taxes that are due but haven't been able to pay them. So that's when I step in and I work on a solution to the problem. So I ended up in this corner by a happy accident. Honestly, I answered an ad for an administrative assistant and I fell into a world that just grabbed a hold of me and impassioned me every single day that I was able to help my clients and work on solutions. Here I am, it's going to be 25 years next month that I've been in this unique area. And I'm still encouraged and impassioned to help everybody that comes across my desk. And to be able to say that after 25 years, I feel like I don't work. I feel like I have a career helping people.
It's very, very niche and it's very unique as well because I hear about stories about business owners get into these they don't think about it. So we often leave things to the last. And I know that some people don't put money aside to pay their tax to make sure that they've got enough money for their tax as well. But what common mistakes do you see entrepreneurs make that lead to these tax troubles in the first place?
Before they start out on their journey with a business, I've seen that a lot of people don't slow down and do their homework. They think about the product that they're creating or that they're selling or the service that they will provide, but they don't think about the P's and Q's of the financial end until they're already in it. And by that point, they may be a quarter or two or a year or two behind. And as you know, with most new businesses, you always have unanticipated hiccups or roadblocks or something that you thought would be easy turns out to be 10 times harder. And something that you thought would only be this much money is twice the cost. So before you go into a business journey, slow down and do your homework, including the taxes. That's where a lot of people end up with a tax debt when it's related to a business, is they don't think about that tax obligation that they'll have, and they're underfunded to cover everything. So as a new business owner, if you're looking at, I pay my supplier so I can keep doing the work and keep employing people and keep satisfying customers, or I pay my taxes and then I can't get the supplies that I need to do the work. So when new business owners are weighing the pros and cons of the bills that they need to address, taxes are always going to be behind everything else. So slow down when you're going on a journey with a new business and talk to your accountant, sit down and make a game plan. So that way you have an educated factor for you to keep in mind when you're looking at how to spend money when you're first starting. The other thing that I've found a lot is that as businesses get bigger, You have to leverage the people who work for you and the amount of time that you have to dedicate places. And a lot of people will hire an in-house bookkeeper or accountant and just say, okay, I'm trusting you with everything. Here's the keys to the kingdom. Here's the keys to our bank accounts. Here's the checks. You can sign stuff. Here's a credit card. And it's like giving a kid in a candy store a $500 bill and saying, go hog wild. If you have no checks and balances over somebody else that you are entrusting with the finances of your business, something is going to happen. Not that we want to think the most pessimistic ways about the people who work for us, but I've seen the biggest offenders with this be family members. I've
Mm.
seen so much embezzlement happen, so much lying on books that they show the owner or the other family members, and it ends up flushing out. And usually the way they embezzle the money is by taking the tax money, because it's very easy to put it as a line item and say, oh, yeah, we paid it, and then file the tax return claiming that you paid it. And then it takes the tax agency putting the numbers together to start sending notices saying, wait a minute, you said you paid this, but you didn't. A lot of times, those trusted people will hide the mail and it will come out a year later, 2 years later. And by that point, it has snowballed into a huge issue.
Yeah, I've heard stories about like not even just family members, like in general too, because like when Wesley Snipes, he had that issue. I think he relied and gave all the numbers to, don't quote me on it, but I know that he got in big trouble because they said that his taxes were paid, and it's hard to
Yeah.
trust people like that. But I know that we should be taking the responsibilities as leaders, business owners, to oversee our books as well, do that due diligence. But do you think how much, so that we can gain knowledge as well, how much should we be ideally setting aside each time? Because every country is different with how much
Mhm.
tax, and it depends on whether you're a company or a sole trader as well. So, what advice do you give? A generic advice on how much money should we set aside each time, whether it be fortnight, like each bi-weekly, month? Like it's a bit hard.
It is hard. And as you brought up, it depends on the state you're in or the province you're in, the country you're in. Really, your best relationship as a business owner or an entrepreneur is with your accountant or CPA. And that's where I would say a lot of self employed people say, oh, but if I pay somebody for this service, it costs me money. You get what you pay for. It is worth the investment to find an accountant who can know your business intimately as you're forming it, as you're starting it, as you're going on your journey, because they're going to be able to keep a watchful eye over you. They'll be able to say, okay, so here's where you are on your growth projection. Here's how much the tax implication will be. Let's make a game plan every week or every month to set aside X number of dollars to meet your obligation. Because it depends on what kind of tax you have an obligation for, right? We have income tax, you have sales tax, you can have local transportation taxes. We have a plumber in New York, and in the state of New York in the US, not only do you charge sales tax for the pipes and the fixtures that you install, you have to charge sales tax on your hourly service charge, which is unique. And that's why getting with your accountant so you can say, okay, this is the business I'm going into. This is where I live. This is the domain that oversees us taxation wise. So, what are the obligations that I need to know about? Because every area has its own unique rules and own unique percentages of what they charge for different types of taxes. Knowing your accountant really well, making sure they know every aspect of your business, they're going to be able to educate you and help you come up with a game plan. So, my biggest takeaway from that would be focus on your relationship with your accountant and make them a trusted, almost board member for
Mm.
your business.
Okay, yes, that's a good advice there. Have you heard some outrageous tax claims that people do? I mean, because some people might not have a close relationship with their CPA or accountant, and they're just pushing the line between what they can claim on tax. But what's the silliest thing that you've heard people try to expense on their tax?
Oh my goodness. That's a really good question. I had a married couple once who claimed that they had 10 dependents, so they didn't get tax income tax very much because with every dependent, you get a tax break.
Mm.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. They owed a couple $100,000 by the time the US IRS found out and put two and two together. That was an interesting one.
How do you lie about the kids, though?
They forged everything on their tax return and social
Oh,
security numbers weren't matching. And yeah, it was fraud, fraud at a very
wow.
basic level. With
Yeah.
business owners, I find that they go two ways. They're so concerned about claiming business expenses that they don't claim everything they could. And then I've seen the ones where they claim everything that they shouldn't. I had one business owner found a way to pay her kids their weekly allowance by claiming they were contractors for her business and she would pay them so much hourly to do things like shred paperwork. I was like, wait a minute. Well, what is this iPad? Well, he needs an iPad so I can communicate to him what his chores are. Oh, no, that's not going to work.
Gosh.
People get
Like,
creative. They really
yeah,
do.
it sounds like some creative accounting going on there. So, but you
Yeah.
did mention there's things that you can claim, but then you don't. So, what are those things that
Right.
people should be considering?
Well, and again, this goes back to that relationship with your accountant is so
Mm.
key because I had a client who had an auto mechanic shop. And he was newer to being a business owner. And he didn't understand that certain supplies in his shop he could write off, like rags to wipe their hands off, the uniforms that he had all of the employees wear. He said, well, I heard that you can't write uniforms off. And I said, if it is part of your business identity and it helps your customers identify your workers as an employee of your business, yes, you most certainly can. There were just a lot of things. He would put out coffee and snacks for people who were waiting for their car to be serviced. And he didn't keep any of those receipts. I'm like, oh, no, that is legitimate business expense because you're taking care of your customers and making them feel comfortable while they're waiting for you to service their vehicle. That is absolutely a business expense. So,
Yeah, you got to go and find the fine line. I guess it depends on what industry you're in too, because I've heard of people trying to claim a lot of meals when it's not even related to their industry. But just say that someone did get a scary letter from the taxman. What's your advice? What's the first thing they should do?
okay, so remember that there is a power role here that you can play, right? If you let something intimidate you to a point where you get fearful about opening it and looking at it, you've already lost your power position. So if you get a note from the IRS or from the tax agency, the first thing I want you to do is take a deep breath and rip it open, read it. Because there are a lot of times that they will reach out to you and say, hey, we were looking at this tax return and we have a question about something that you reported online, such and such. Can you send us more information? And a lot of times you say, oh, sure, no problem. You send it in, and that is the last you hear from them. Other times there were mathematical errors on your tax return. Something didn't transpose right. We've had a lot of instances where they say, hey, we didn't get your tax return. Can you send it in again? And if you're too afraid to open those notices and you shove them in the back of the drawer and you don't deal with it, it just starts snowballing. And then they're going to assume things on your behalf, and it's never going to be in your best interest. So then you end up with a much bigger bill than if you would have just said, "Oh, wait a minute, I can handle this." Don't don't let your fear cause a paralysis of inaction, right? You give up your power. Even if you've got a bill and you know it's coming, and let's say it's $50,000, right? Which is a big chunk of money, and you know it's coming, and you get that first bill, best thing you can do is open it up and call the tax agency and say, I got this bill. I can't afford to pay it right now. What can we do? And that's how you start navigating to a solution. So just don't give up your power position with it.
Do you think that usually, if it's the case, if it's a big tax bill, do they give you payment plans? Because I've heard Layla Hermosi talk about on her episode once that she had a massive bill, a couple of million or something, a massive bill, and then she had to pay it. And it was like, that's crazy. And if you don't have the money for that, do they
Right.
do payment plans and help you that way?
They definitely will. And if it's the first time that you've ever had a problem, you can ask them to forgive part of the penalties that they will add on top of the bill. Like here in the US, you can have penalties for failure to make estimated tax payments throughout the year, failure to file on time, late
Mm.
payment penalties. So they stack these penalties on top of everything. So if it's the first time you've had a problem, call them up and say, hey, look, I can't afford to pay this. I can set it up on monthly payments. How about $250 a month? And they're going to push back on you because their job is to collect as much as possible, as quickly as possible. But just stick to your guns and say, I'm sorry, just with all my other obligations for my and my family's health and welfare, I can't offer you more money than this. And ask them to forgive the penalties and start that dialogue. What's the worst thing they can say? No,
That's true. Yeah.
right?
Have you ever seen the IRS? Like, if you're owing a certain amount and they can remove the penalty, do you think that they can actually wipe? Because sometimes if you're in credit card debt, for example, and
Yeah.
you're paying it off over time, they can just say, look, we'll give you this amount to pay off. Let's make a deal. Take the 30% off the whole thing and you can pay it off in one go. Does the taxman ever do something like that?
So every tax agency is different. Here in the US, most of the tax agencies have a settlement program, but you have to prove without a shadow of a doubt that you can't afford to pay it for the coming 10 years. Like with no matter what payments you make, it'll never be paid in full. They look at every aspect of your financial condition when they consider a settlement like that. They'll look at your bank statements and see how many times a week do you go to Starbucks, right? And they'll hold that against you because they'll say, well, you can afford to pay us, but your spending habits don't allow you to right now. So we're going to say no, stop spending $5 or $8 a day at Starbucks and pay us that money. But they do have programs if you can legitimately prove that you can't afford to pay it. They do have programs where they will settle it. But boy, it is not a cakewalk. It usually takes about a year to work through that program.
Wow. I heard audits are pretty a nightmare too. And I was just thinking, like, in some states in America, for example, my mentor, he moved to a different state to just avoid the taxes because where he was, it was just ridiculous. And I know that LA and San Fran, the tax is so
Mhm.
high, and so people are going to different states. Can you give us any tips and advice on how to? Because I know the big corporations like Google don't pay much tax, and the big tech companies, they've got loopholes, and everyday people like business owners, we don't have that luxury as well. So have you got any tips on how we can reduce our taxes? I know that in Australia, I think I'm not an expert, but if you have a different category, so there's PTY LTD, and that's a company tax versus the sole trader tax, going to get more tax as an individual, then it goes at different levels, and then you pay a different bracket of tax.
Sure.
But I think LLCs as well in America, they don't pay as much tax, and there's different, if you're a church or something, that then you're limited on how much tax you pay as well. So
Yeah,
basically,
you're
what
right.
advice do
Yeah.
you have?
With churches or charities, they're a non-for-profit organization, so they don't have certain taxes that the rest of the companies and the structures have. Um, there are different ways to leverage your taxes, and it's really funny. People hear that big corporations don't pay taxes, right? This is a misnomer that has been shared through mainstream media over and over and over and over and over again. Don't believe it. They pay a ton of taxes. Think about how many employees they have. Okay. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of employees for a place like Google or Coca Cola or Microsoft. They pay taxes on the payroll that they distribute to the employees. Okay. So when you have an employee, at least in the US, there are a couple of components. The employee pays their income tax, it's taken out of their paycheck, and then they pay a portion of Medicare and Social Security. The company matches the Medicare and Social Security and pays unemployment and workers' comp on these people. So for every employee, it could cost a company a few $1,000s in taxes. So when you expand it to they have 100,000 employees, look at how much they are actually paying. And that's just in payroll tax. So these larger companies will employ their own tax staff to say, okay, how do we leverage this money to minimize the tax we end up paying on the income part as much as possible? A lot of the monies that they spend then, not to divert away from paying taxes, but to benefit their tax strategy, will be in things like creating foundations and giving money away. So there's a give and take. It always makes me laugh when I hear, oh, these big corporations, they don't pay any taxes. I'm like, no, they actually pay in different ways than the common income tax. You have to remember with corporations, at least some structures of corporations, any profits flow through to the owners and then they pay tax on that money. So in the US, an S corporation doesn't have an income tax that it pays directly. The profits flow through to all the shareholders and the owners, and then they pay income tax on that money they receive from the corporation. So it's not taxed at the corporate level, it's taxed at the individual level. But it is taxed money. And every country has their own structures on how they do it. But again, it goes back to employing tax strategy through your accountant or your CPA. Have them be almost a board member for you and your business. And they're going to be able to say, okay, as we're building, okay, we may want to change our entity structure from here in the US, maybe a single member LLC, and convert the business into an S-corp because there are different tax advantages that we can take advantage of. So again, work with your accountant, your CPA. They're going to be your best friend with employing the tax strategies that you are able to claim at your level.
Do you know much about trusts as well? Like, should business
Mm.
owners have trusts, or is that more on a CPA
That's
tax?
that's more on a legal aspect, actually. So at that point, you're wanting to speak with an attorney or a tax attorney about trusts and estates and things like that. It's definitely not something that we deal with in our corner just because you have to be so specialized. You have to know here in the US, every state is different. They have their own laws. And then every country is different. They have their own laws. So definitely speak with your accountant and talk to an attorney and say, okay, here's where we are with our entity. What would you recommend we do? What about estates or trusts? And they'll take you down that road. But boy, you want a specialist because they're going to make sure that anything you employ is rock solid.
Wow. Okay, that's great advice there. How can entrepreneurs turn their tax management into a strength for their business as well? Because we do want to avoid being in a tax debt situation at the last minute, and you've given us some great tips, but how can we turn that into a strength? Because a lot of people fear that, the tax man. So how can
Mhm.
entrepreneurs turn that tax management into a strength?
So, have you ever heard the phrase, those things that you don't want to do are probably the things you should spend your first moments of the day doing, right? So
Getting
you
on
don't
with it.
push it off.
Yeah.
A lot of it is just employing a really good habit with it. Make it the first thing that you look at. If you have any questions, reach out to your accountant or CPA first thing. That is going to keep you in the power position of knowing that you're in control of your finances. Again, not that I'm trying to speak to the power hungry or the control freaks. All of us who are business entrepreneurs have to be a little bit of a control freak to a degree, but add it as another tool on your tool belt, right? Like I've got my customers, boom. I've got my services, boom. I've got my product, boom. Okay, I've got my tax management, boom. Think of it as not something to fear, but something to conquer. So I've worked with some accountants and CPAs over the decades, and we've helped come up with some ideas for common types of taxes that business owners will run into. One of the first things is sales tax. When you sell a product and you collect a tax from your customer and you hold it in trust to turn over to your tax agency, open a separate bank account. And every day at the end of the day, whatever your sales tax obligation is, move that money to that account and know that that account doesn't get touched at all because that is your sales tax that you've collected from the public. I've had larger companies that I've worked with do the same thing with payroll, making sure they've got payroll money. Every time they get in an accounts receivable, they'll carve it up. Okay, this percentage is going to operations and supplies. This percentage is going to payroll. This percentage is going to taxes. And it lets you kind of be the master of your domain, right? Know what your obligations are and set fail-proof systems in place to stay a step ahead of it. And it's going to always make sure that you have the money for your sales tax obligation or your payroll tax obligation. We have a lot of self-employed realtors, and being in real estate, it's feast or famine. You have these seasons, right? And you may have 5 big deals that you sell, and then you don't have anything the rest of the year. So you really have to be very disciplined in making sure that you're setting aside money for things like your taxes. So what we've done is, let's say somebody sells 5 deals in March and April, okay? And we will look at the prior year's tax return and say, okay, your income tax was an average of 28%. So every deal you close, when you get your commission check, let's take 28% and make a tax payment, because you can make tax payments ahead of time and you can pay them as frequently as you want. So if you just discipline yourself to carve out the tax out of every big income you earn throughout the year, you're going to stay ahead of the game.
That's a different perspective as well about sales, because I sell products as well. But putting money aside every day, that's a unique way to think of it, because then that way you just have one of your bank accounts, label it as tax, and then after each. But every day, I do that every day, or should I do that every week in terms of putting when the money comes in from the sales? Because it doesn't come in every day, but I guess when it comes in, actually, no, it does come in from my vending machines. But yeah, I should be setting money aside into that tax pool, basically. And it's all about budgeting as well, right?
Mm-hmm. It is. It is. But it's also, as a business owner, it's so tempting to dump everything into your operating account and just use it as you need it. If you do that, you're running the risk of dipping into money that really isn't yours, especially when you're talking about something like sales tax. Because when you sell an item to your customer, the money they're paying you, part of it is for sales tax. And if you don't carve that money out right away and you leave it in your operating account, something happens, you have a hiccup, you use that money to pay your payroll. And then all of a sudden, sales tax is due, and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have any money now. And then all of a sudden, COVID hits, and you don't have any sales for 6 months. And you're wondering how you pay the sales tax for the items that you sold in March, right before everything shut down. It's a discipline, and staying in front of it is the best thing you can do for yourself.
How much do you think we should set aside? I know that some people have in businesses, it's like feast or famine as well. And
Right.
we should have a backup savings as well for some people say a year or something or 6 months. But what are your thoughts? How much should we set aside just for these emergencies that do happen?
So there's all kinds of different theories on that. I try to keep 3 months of my operating expenses in a nest egg, or at least something that I can tap if something happens and we have another COVID situation. With ongoing collection of sales tax, it's going to depend on what that percentage is that you're obligated to collect and hold. So again, I'm diverting back to your CPA or accountant who knows your tax obligations intimately and will be able to tell you the percentage.
Okay, cool. But ideally, I guess 3 months sounds like it's a doable thing to have in operational expenses.
Yeah, yeah, I would say so. And then as you grow and as your profit margin increases, maybe make it 4 months.
That's true. Setting that money aside when the times are good.
Yes, you can always set money aside if you can carve it out without hurting anything else. It's never a bad thing to have a nest egg. And then when you're looking at something like, I need to invest in new computers for my company. Well, that's going to be $20,000. Okay, well, it'll suck to take some of that nest egg and put it into that, but it's worth it because it's going to improve our productivity or whatever may be the justification for spending the money to begin with. But then you have it and you don't feel that pinch as hard.
Yeah, that's true. Let's talk about success stories. Without naming any names, can you share a case study where you turned things around for a client?
Sure, sure. I had a couple who owed over $400,000 in income tax. The husband had it first for 8 years, and then they started filing jointly, and then they had new tax debt for another 4 years after. So between the two, it was over $400,000. And they both were self employed. And he was a tradesman, and she was a medical assistant in a contractor role.
But
And
how did it get so high? Did they not file their taxes for years? Is that why?
they filed them, they just didn't pay them. And they would get notices from the IRS and kind of shove them in the back of the drawer. And both of them ran their businesses. Money comes in, money goes right back out. They had a family. They kind of spoiled the children, right? They spent money in ways that they shouldn't have. They didn't have a home, they rented. They had older vehicles. And when you looked at them on paper, it was okay, how did this happen where you ended up owing this much money? Because you don't make that much money. But they had both had good years and didn't put the money towards taxes. They spent it for vacations and stuff like that. Yeah,
That's something easy to
well,
do. If you
it's
just
easy to justify, right? It really is. You only live once, and our kids are only going to be young once, and our kids are going to only have this experience once in their life. And, it's very easy to justify bad spending. Actually, I should clarify that bad spending habits, because all of us will imbibe from time to time. You just can't do it on a consistent basis. You can't live your life as a pauper and know you're making money and you could spend it, but you just don't for fear that it will go away. It's almost like you push money away at that point. I've known people who have their entire life saved 50% of every dollar that they've made, which is good. But if you're not enjoying life to a certain degree, what are you working so hard for? So, getting back to this couple, we pulled together a financial statement, and the key to doing a settlement was they had to stay compliant with their tax obligations. And because they're self employed, they had to be over attentive to their tax obligations. So every pay period, we were saying, okay, how much did you receive every time they got paid for a job? How much did you receive? All right, we're taking this percentage and you're going to make a tax deposit. And there's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it because this is a condition of getting this settlement. It took a year and a half, but we finally settled at $14,800. And there would be times where they would bark at me. And I'd call them and say, okay, you got paid. How much did you get paid? Let's make this tax payment. And I don't want to. I can't believe I have to do this. I'm like, I'm telling you, this is going to benefit you in the long run. Work with me here. Follow my lead. I told you I will take you by the hand and guide you through this, but you can't quit now. And it
Wait,
took a year and a half, and we ended up settling for pennies on the dollar.
instead of
Yeah.
400,000, they only got to pay 14,000.
I think it was 14,800 and some change. Yeah. It was,
Wow.
and it's a legitimate program. But the hard part is you really have to prove I can't pay this back. Look at my bank statements, look at my credit card statements. You go under a microscope to such a degree, they almost ask what color are the underwear you're wearing. They really will investigate you from 100 different angles. But if you can qualify for the program, it's a great way to reset. It's a great way to shed that old debt and be able to start afresh.
Wow. Does it take a level of negotiation as well on your behalf, or how did that happen?
A lot, a lot of negotiation. When we
Mm.
submitted the petition, the IRS came back and said, they can full pay. Here's how we calculate that. And I came back with, are you out of your mind? Let's go through these numbers again. It's a lot of negotiating. And when somebody is facing a situation like that, it is always best to have an experienced professional involved. It just is because they know the programs, they know what you will qualify for, they will know what you won't qualify for, and not to waste your time or the money paying a specialist to handle it.
Wow. That's really great advice on how you can help. And in terms of your book is called Tax Debt Rule Number One, There's Always a Solution. How does this mindset apply to other life challenges? Because it does sound like mindset. And I know that I've had other guests
Mhm.
talking about money and that financial thermostat that we're so used to as well. It's all about being self disciplined. But can you give us any other tips on this mindset? How does this apply to other life challenges?
Oh my goodness, I feel like it applies to everything. I've had moments in my life where I will receive something in the mail or I'll receive a phone call and it makes my pulse start going, right? And I almost feel like I'm getting called to the principal's office as a kid.
Mm.
Oh my gosh, am I in trouble? What did I do? A lot of it comes down to breathing, taking an outside perspective of whatever problem you're facing. And it's like, okay, how old are you? And have you ever come up against a situation that could not be solved one way or another? Maybe it didn't end up the way that you had hoped it would, but it came to a solution, correct? So every challenge that you've had in business eventually comes to a head and you come to a solution and you move on. I mean, we've all survived our lives to this point. So it means that we've gotten past so many problems and so many roadblocks in life. There's always a solution. You just have to sometimes step back from it and try to look at it from a new perspective. And that's what I share in my book about taxes. Don't give up your power position to the tax agencies because you're afraid of the unknown. None of us would be in business if we were afraid of the unknown. We just wouldn't because it takes a lot of backbone to branch out on your own and say, I've got an idea. I'm going to pursue this. And maybe you have a family depending on the income that you're going to bring in with it. It is scary to go into business. But every challenge you have come up against, you've always come up with a solution at some point. So remember that. It really does add another tool to that proverbial tool belt that we all wear.
Yeah, and I agree with business. If you're not a solutions person, like a natural problem solver, it's going to be a bit difficult because you're going to have a lot of fires to put out and you're going to have to be.
Hmm.
I think business is all about building a puzzle. What piece needs to fit in terms to let it run smoothly. So, for those aspiring entrepreneurs out there, what advice would you give to someone starting their own business, regardless of what industry?
Do your homework. Do your homework. And when you think you've exhausted all of it, talk to somebody else who has started a business or a professional who advises new business entrepreneurs and say, what am I missing? Drill deep, deeper than you think you need to before you go on that path. And I don't say that to delay you from starting, but to make sure you have everything in place and you've considered absolutely every aspect before you open your doors.
Okay, beautiful. If you weren't into the tax resolution world, what other businesses would you be curious to try?
Oh, good. I think event planning. I spend
Okay,
a
why is
lot
that?
of time donating my time to like my kids' schools or foundations, and I always end up gravitating towards putting on fundraisers and things like that and coming up with unique ideas. I think that's probably what I would do, but I'm
Yes.
such a numbers nerd that this industry, this corner of the tax world is really my happy place.
Yeah, if you feel like you're passionate about something, it doesn't feel like work if you love what you're
Mm-mm,
doing.
not
Yeah,
at all.
beautiful. I totally agree there. And it's interesting because like I know that this might sound a bit sexist, but a lot of females don't like to look at their numbers, and I've spoken to many guests about that too. And I've seen mistakes that people make, entrepreneurs that make that don't like their numbers and they have to tackle it front on. So if there's one key piece of advice you want to leave the audience, what would that be?
There's always a solution. No matter what kind of problem it is, there's always a solution. My corner of the world has to deal with tax debt, but it applies to everything as a business owner or somebody who's going into business. There's always a solution. Don't let anything get bigger than you. Don't let your fear make it bigger than you.
Beautiful. Guys, if you find this valuable, please do me a favor. Hit the like and the subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, or hit the follow button and let me know your thoughts. Finally, where can people find you, Morgan, if they want to connect with you?
goldenliontaxsolutions.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, Facebook. Just look up Morgan Anderson EA. Put the Q in the middle.
I will leave a link in the description as well.
Yes, wonderful. Linda, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.